The moment you choose to be silent, respect begins to take root. It's not the kind of silence that's awkward or uncomfortable, but rather the deliberate, strategic kind that precedes your entrance into a room. This kind of silence makes people think twice before speaking to you, not out of fear, but out of calculation. Niccolò Machiavelli understood this concept better than most, recognizing that the world is moved by perception, power, and the psychological space created by silence. When you don't speak, people start paying attention, not because your words lack value, but because your silence has taken on a value of its own. The more available you are, the less you're respected. The more you explain, the less authority you carry. And the more you react, the easier you are to control. However, when you go quiet, everything shifts and silence disrupts the expected flow. People are used to noise, access, and instant replies. But when you remove that, they become confused and start to wonder what happened. Machiavelli wrote about the importance of being perceived as someone who is not easy to reach, someone who is not emotionally reactive, and someone who is not always explaining or justifying. This begins with silence, which allows people to project, assume, and wonder. In that uncertainty, you gain control. When you're always talking, you're revealing your strategy, position, and internal state, giving others access to your thoughts and feelings. However, when you go quiet, there's nothing to work with, and you're left with stillness and presence. The kind of presence that demands respect is not the kind that chases, begs, or needs to be liked. It's the kind that stands firm, calm, and deliberate. This is the art of controlled presence, being intentional about where you show up, who you respond to, and how much you say. It's not about manipulation, but about protection. Protecting your energy, focus, mystery, and influence. You don't need to post daily to be respected. You don't need to talk more to be understood. And you don't need to be in every room to be remembered. You just need to master your silence. Respect doesn't come from visibility. It comes from selective presence. Words create noise, but silence creates impact. Silence is not weakness. It's not absence. It's not retreat. It's strategy. The most dangerous people in any room are not the loud ones, but the ones who say almost nothing yet control everything. Machiavelli knew that words can be manipulated, but silence cannot be misquoted, distorted, or used against you. When you go quiet, people start managing themselves around you. They speak more carefully, wonder what you're thinking, and adjust their tone. They ask questions instead of making assumptions, not because you raised your voice, but because you withdrew it. This is the power of silence, which creates space and forces others to confront their own discomfort, insecurity, and addiction to being seen and heard. In every dynamic, whether business, relationships, or friendships, there's a psychological economy at play. People trade value, access, and energy, but if you give too much too quickly, you devalue yourself. The person who's always replying immediately is not respected. They're expected. The one who's always available is not seen as generous. They're seen as easy. The one who explains everything every time is not seen as honest. They're seen as uncertain. And uncertainty kills respect. Machiavelli would tell you to never let others see your full hand, never react emotionally in public, and never let your silence become uncomfortable to you. Let it become uncomfortable to them. Because when you're truly in control, you don't just speak less, you speak last. And often, that's enough. Respect isn't built in what you say, it's built in when you say it, and more importantly, when you don't. In arguments, most people try to win, dominate, or prove they're right. But in doing so, they lose something far more valuable: mystery, composure, and presence. Machiavelli would advise you to let the other person speak first, reveal their fears, angle, and intent. While they speak, you stay still, hold your frame, and listen not to agree or disagree, but to observe. And when they finish, you answer in 10 words what they said in 100. That's power. That's influence. That's respect. Silence doesn't just reveal others, it restores you. When you speak constantly, you spend energy, react, and leak information. But when you pull back, you return to your center. You notice things, hear the tone, feel the energy shift, and recognize what's real and what's performance. And that's what builds gravitas, the weight behind your presence. People remember the person who walks into a room, doesn't speak much, and doesn't overexplain. But when they do say something, everyone leans in. Why? Because they've trained the world to listen, not by talking more, but by talking less, strategically, calmly, and deliberately. If you want to become that person, you must learn what Machiavelli taught centuries ago. Silence is the beginning of respect and the end of manipulation. People can't twist your silence. They can't weaponize it. They can't pull it out of context because you gave them nothing. And nothing is powerful, nothing is scary, nothing is unforgettable. Think of how many arguments, betrayals, or disrespectful moments could have ended with one thing: your silence. Not silence out of weakness, but out of strategy. A silence that says, I don't need to lower myself to respond to this. Most people are taught the wrong things about communication. They're taught to keep the peace, talk it out, and never leave anything unsaid. But Machiavelli understood something truer. Control doesn't come from saying more. It comes from saying less at the right time. Your greatest influence comes not from what you say, but from what you choose not to respond to. You don't need to address every insult. You don't need to clarify every misunderstanding. You don't need to follow up with people who never valued your effort. You need to do one thing: protect your presence. And silence is protection. When you go quiet, people project, imagine, fill in the gaps, and assume you're doing better without them. They assume your silence is power, not absence. And whether it is or it isn't, you've already won because they're adjusting to you now. That's the Machiavellian method. You don't force respect, you don't ask for it. You create the conditions in which people have no choice but to give it. And silence is the first condition. In modern life, silence is luxury. It's scarcity. And scarcity breeds value. If you speak all day online, your words are diluted. If you post constantly, your presence is forgettable. If you respond instantly, your attention becomes expected, not appreciated. But the one who speaks once and it echoes, that's the one they remember. This is not about mystery for mystery's sake. It's about control. Controlling what you give, how you move, and when you disappear and reappear. People remember the person who left at their highest point, who didn't explain themselves, and who they couldn't figure out no matter how hard they tried. They forget the oversharer, the people pleaser, and the one who was always around, always giving, always justifying their existence. Don't be that one. Be the one who walks away mid-conversation, not out of disrespect, but because your time expired. Be the one who says little in meetings, but whose words move the whole direction of the room. You teach people how to treat you by what you tolerate in silence, but you reteach them how to treat you by going silent. That is the reset. Not a speech, not an argument, not an emotional breakdown, but absence. When you disappear from places that drained you, stop answering calls from people who never poured into you, and retreat from conversations that only lead to disrespect, that's when they finally feel your value, because now it's missing. Machiavelli believed that those in power should never become too familiar. He wrote that familiarity breeds contempt, and it still does. Let them wonder where you went. Let them question if they pushed too far. Let them reflect. And while they do, you grow in stillness, self-control, and clarity. Because here's the secret. While others are scrambling to be heard, you're building the kind of presence that doesn't need an introduction. You walk into a room, and the energy shifts not because of what you say, but because of what you don't. You've become the person whose time matters, whose voice has weight, and whose attention is earned, not assumed. And all of that started the second you went quiet. The loudest person isn't the most respected. The most liked person isn't the most remembered. The most available person isn't the most valued. But the most silent person, the one who speaks with intent, disappears without warning, and returns with purpose. That person becomes unforgettable. So now you decide, will you keep filling silence to feel useful, or will you use silence to feel powerful? Will you keep explaining your worth, or will you withdraw and let them experience your absence? Because there's a difference between being respected and being used, and that difference starts the second you go quiet.